Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay in the back and everything? It's working okay? Okay, great. And I have to start by saying that I'm incredibly honored to have been asked by Professor Rodney Fry to be a part of this Turning the Wheel Humanities Exploration Colloquium talk. And so for today, I picked the title, Quien soy yo? Who am I? For the synopsis of the talk, one thing I wrote is that I don't presume that my story may have meaning to anybody else but me. But however, some time ago, a long time ago, I remember a particular aha moment in the early 1990s when I was studying issues of white privilege, just beginning to understand critical race theory, learning about qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research, hearing of the use of the term other, reading Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice, and there I was. I was in the stories of the others. Other people had felt like me and feel like me. And so maybe if I share my story, I might give someone else that same feeling of connection and the sense of finally belonging. I'm not such an outsider after all. So all my life I've lived in two worlds, plus my own private world. The so-called Hispanic world, the so-called American world, and my private world of my hopes and my dreams and my aspirations, my dark thoughts, my judgments, and my fears. I was and still am on the lifelong quest to discover who I am, and fittingly to the turning of the wheel exploration, who we are, my chosen communities, and the peoples I have lived with and live amongst. I always ponder how to make connections with others, with their lived experiences, how to make meaning and be meaningful in my work, in service, and in relationship with others. I've now been with my Moscow and University of Idaho community for 2.5 years. Prior to this, I've lived my whole life in Illinois. I'm from Chicago originally, and then lived in the southern part of the state for many years, 350 miles south of Chicago. It's a very long state, and with a different, somewhat warmer climate and less flat terrain than the rest of the state. More cliffs, more natural beauty, a rural region, also a college town, much like Moscow. That's Carbondale, Illinois. My talk today is about some different things. First, I'd like to talk to you about my life story, who I am, what has motivated me, what's inspired me, the path I took to college and getting a bachelor's and a master's and a doctorate and making higher education my professional home. I also want to talk to you about how I came to do what I do. What does it mean to do human rights? What's access? What's inclusion? Why is this my profession? And I want to try to place my remarks in the context of the turning wheel. All of us have different ways in which we identify. For each connected realm or dimension of identity, the metaphor of the spoke of the wheel, works well. I know many of my spokes. I can name them. I can describe them. I can explain the connections between my spokes and how they turn the wheel. But what I have discovered, and it really came in preparing for today, what I've discovered is that I've been constantly trying to name what's at the center. What is my center? What is the inner circle of the spokes that connects to the outer wheel? Can I name that inner circle? Can I describe it? Can I explain how it enables all my identities to be connected, to be a whole? Mi nombre es Carmen Alejandra Teresa Suarez. A sus órdenes. I have a very strong identity as a Latina. I do not self-identify as Chicana. I self-identify as Latina. Chicago Latina. My father's from Mexico, Mexico City. My mother is from the United States, mostly Irish background. However, my fair skin is not to be attributed to her. My father was very fair-skinned, and we look much alike. My father came to this country twice as undocumented. We are not farm worker background, agricultural or landscaping. We are urban, so my father would work as a busboy. That's what they were called, not bus staff, not busser, but a bus boy. And in that time period, the mid-50s, Most were black or brown. He had a story he told of one period of time he was working in the U.S. in Chicago. It's prior to meeting my mother. He was working as a busboy at a restaurant in the Drake Hotel. And for anybody not from Chicago, which most people aren't here, but the Drake Hotel is an extremely posh hotel, very expensive, a lot of nice restaurants in it. And he was working in one of the restaurants. And immigration, what we call la migra, came in to the restaurant, and he was in the middle of setting tables. And again, he looks like me. So they asked him, where are the wetbacks? And so he took his thumb and he went like this, and he went out the front door and he got on the L, and the L is an elevated train, and he rode it to the end of the line. As he said, if he had said a word, they would have known instantly he too was an immigrant, because he had a thick accent until the day he died. I say that my mother is an early feminist. Before the term feminist was in use, she went to college right after World War II, and she had studied Spanish in high school and in college, became very fluent. She went to work for Betty Crocker, and she was sent to live and work in Mexico City because she was fluent in Spanish. There she met my dad, who at that time, now late 1950s, was a maitre d' at a club called El Uno Dos Tres, and it was an American hangout, and with many American Hollywood types. We have pictures of my dad with Jimmy Durante, Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, many of the Rat Pack members. He was very proud of that. And my mom would go to the club, and they met, married, lived in Mexico, and when she became pregnant with me, they moved back to the U.S. Obviously bringing my dad with, that's how he became a permanent resident, and she wanted her children born in the United States to be American citizens. And back to my dad and the Drake Hotel restaurant story. I tell this story because it's about how others see us, how that shapes us. My dad made sure that we would understand that La Migra looked at skin color first, and we shouldn't forget it. Lots of our cousins and a half-brother and a half-sister of mine looked more typical. And people discriminated. This wasn't right, and he wanted us to learn that. And that we, in turn, should never discriminate. The issue of discrimination, because of my dad's stories, because of growing up in Chicago, because of seeing what happened to people with darker skin than mine, shaped me. I did not know as a child the word privilege and this whole theory and concept of privilege, but I sure knew that I was a whole lot luckier than others, and others in my own family. At the same time, I was shaped by a mom who was very inclusive, very tolerant. She was a Protestant who married a Catholic in a time when that wasn't done. She was a USA white girl who married a Mexican in a time when that wasn't done. She was a boss in a company and hired black people in a time when that wasn't done. And I have another story. I remember asking my mother about why blacks were black. Why was their skin color different? And she told me people were like ice cream. Anybody who knows me knows I love to eat. I eat a lot, and I love ice cream. And I did as a child. And she said people were like ice cream. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, and sometimes all mixed together. And just like all the ice cream flavors were delicious, the different colors of people were really good too. Imagine how being told that as a child shapes a child. So I have my Mexican dad, macho, ruler of the home, my mom working outside of the home and expected to take care of the home too. My mom making more money than my dad in a time when that wasn't as common. Culture clashes, as we called them then, occurred on a daily basis in my home. Ultimately, when I was about 4, my dad brought a female cousin, who I refer to as Aunt, Tia, of his, to our home as a quasi-nanny. My mom was expecting my brother. It also shaped me to have a caregiver who knew no English and was a brand new immigrant to this country and with whom I spent all my time. And when I was even younger, when I was 2, I was sent for many months to visit relatives in Mexico. And that must have been when my language skills were developing, because I came back speaking Spanish and I knew no English. And my mom's mom, my grandmother, my American grandmother, was appalled. I use that word because she repeated that throughout my life, how appalled she was that I could not speak English at that time. And she would tell me that she would try to teach me, Mary had a little lamb. And she would try to make me to repeat it, and I would say, no puedo, that I couldn't. And she always had that upset look when she told that story. So I did grow up bicultural and bilingual. We always spoke Spanish in the home, English with American grandmother, and at school, of course, English. And I lived in the inner city of Chicago, on the near north side, on the border of neighborhoods called Rogers Park and Edgewater. Chicago itself imparts identity, political identity, and attitude. I refer to Chicago as the center of the universe, and I'm really only half kidding. At the time I was in early elementary school, many parts of Chicago were seeing a great influx of Latinos, and they were Mexican, Puerto Rican, and in case you don't know, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and Cubans, Cubanos. I went to a Catholic grade school and was the only one in the whole school, teachers and students, who spoke both English and Spanish. Then another boy in school, when I was in 3rd grade, called me a spick. I didn't know what that meant, but from his tone, I could tell it wasn't very good. I went home and I told my mom and dad. They explained what it meant, and the next day my mother went to the school. And let me back up a bit here. Again, I grew up speaking both languages and eating comida mexicana, Mexican food, in the house. And some of my dad's family were coming over, some with papers, some without. My aunts and cousins did some good cooking, and we all talked in Spanish all the time. And I went to that same Catholic grade school and lived in the same community from kindergarten to 8th grade. Like all of Chicago, our neighborhood was rapidly turning Latino. We were mostly Mexican and a few Cubanos. And this started when I was in 2nd grade. And as I told you, I'm the only one in the entire school community that speaks both languages. So I was called quite often, starting in 2nd grade, to the principal's office to translate. And so this kind of puts into context the story of the boy calling me a spick. He was jealous I was getting to leave class, and he'd heard that particular word most likely at home and knew how to apply it. So this is an 8-year-old boy in a Catholic school, supposedly the home of teaching about loving others, who knew the word spick and how to use it. And I'd been taught people were like ice cream. It's also the context for the next part of my story. In 5th grade, I got called out of my classroom and sent to a meeting room. All of us that were in there were Mexican/Mexican American, plus a few Cubans. There's always just a few Cubans in my neighborhood. An older woman began speaking to us very slowly in English. This is a very vivid memory. So by this point, I'm 10, I'm in 5th grade, I've been a good student, been translating, all that kind of stuff. She would point to a glass and say glass, a pen and say pen, and try and say other things, and give us instructions in English, and it was clear a lot of the other students weren't understanding. So I started translating because I assumed that's why I was there. I was brought there to translate. I've been doing it for 3 years now for the school. After a while, she told me I spoke very good English, and I said, thank you. I told my mom about the meeting from English class that night, and she was in the school with the principal the next day. My mom had to go a lot. What's the point of this story? They identified us solely by our last names. At that time period, we were not doing the kind of racial and ethnic identification we do now, and we do it for a very good reason, I would like to say, especially to the students in this room, but that's not the topic today. But we were called Spanish surname. So they took out their class lists, and they picked out everybody with a Spanish last name and sent us to learn English, whether we knew English or not, including the only person who spoke both languages and had translated for them. Think about how that shapes a person. And so I'm living in Chicago, and it's the time of Black Power, La Raza, the Chicano Movement, Latino identity development. It was a very exciting time. Tejanos and Californios were chanting, we didn't cross the border crossed us, and stuff like that. There was the women's movement, and they were burning their bras, and the Vietnam protests. And there were riots at the university in Mexico City, fighting for the rights of the indigenous peoples. And one of my cousins, one of my dark-skinned cousins, came and lived with us for a year after that because he'd been involved in some of the protests, fighting for the rights of Indians, of his own rights. And there was the Chicago 7 trial, and seeing the newspaper renderings of Bobby Seale tied to a chair in a U.S. courtroom, gagged, while his fair trial by a jury of his peers was going on. I was still young, 10, 11, and 12 years old, and it was really heady stuff. Fighting for what was right stirred my blood, and that feeling was and is indescribable for me. Also, remember, I'm at a Roman Catholic school, and this is before Roe v. Wade, so we don't have any discussions about that. Rather, the focus and exploration of translating our spiritual values into good works with social justice. If you look up social justice, you'll find that it grows from some teachings and tenets within the Roman Catholic theology. We were imbued with notions of helping those less fortunate. And believe it or not, we were taught this from a non-condescending and what now we would now term a non-cultural deficit model. We were no better than anybody else. There, but for the grace of God, go I. God gave us gifts of healthy bodies and minds and families that could feed us, clothe us, and pay for us to go to school. And we needed to, as we now say, pay it back, pay it forward. We were taught this by younger teachers and seminarians who put it in the context of the day. We sang often to a guitar. We had guitar masses, so it was very exciting. Lean on me. I think I know every word of that song. In 7th grade, I read not only the cross and the switchblade, but they had us read Black Like Me. If you never read that, go read that. It's called Black Like Me. Looking back on it, we had remarkably progressive teachers. And at the same time, this was inner city Chicago, with all that goes with the label of being an inner city, and some neighborhood events and people. A tough exterior and a matching attitude was needed as well. My parents then bought their home, the American Dream. They moved to the new suburbs of Chicago, to the northwest. And everybody was all white, all Republican. We were yellow dog daily Democrats, as any good Chicagoan is. I had a fight with a boy in one of my history classes at that high school who also used the term wetback and said Mexicans needed to go back home. And he too focused on my color and said I wasn't really Mexican and I should be more proud to be American. I fought with him continuously and would yell at him in the hallways. He stirred an anger in me that I had not felt before. I have to say that it really was rage, and it was hard to control. If I saw him, I went out of my way to get in his face, as we now say. It was not something I planned out, but it was very Chicago of me. These suburban kids weren't used to that kind of behavior, and it empowered me, and it gave me a sense of getting my own back. And at the same time as all that outside the home, inside the home, it was a traditional male-dominated household. My dad ruled, and he was very traditional. For example, I could have girls come over to my house for sleepovers, but I was never allowed to go to a sleepover at anybody else's house because a good girl doesn't sleep away from home until she gets married. My brothers are wonderful men, wonderful fathers, but I was a better student. I was more responsible. I was the best kid. And they got to go out at night, and I was never allowed to go out at night. And the answer was, they're not going to get pregnant, you are. Think about that from another identity, from gender, how that might shape a female. Whose responsibility is it if somebody gets pregnancy? Just the female? I don't know that that was my dad's intention, but that was the message I received. Going to college was a very big fight. He supported me going to college, but close to home and commuting. He tried to bribe me with a brand new car if I would go to Loyola in Chicago, a nice Jesuit Catholic university. And that's not where I attended. My mom and I won, and I went away and talked to him about living on campus and the whole residential experience, but it was hard on him. He really cried when I left. It was a difficult time. We were all very emotional. My mom came to visit in college, but he never did, and he died while I was in college. And then I get to college, and there's something called Latin American Studies. It was like about my people. It wasn't quite Latino studies as we have today, about the experience of those that are born here or brought here and how it is to grow up in the United States. But it was a start. It was about our families' nations of origin. And people at college were accepting my identity as a Latina. I was encouraged to apply for scholarships and then for graduate school and graduate assistantships. There weren't too many people like me there identifying as Latina at the university, so I gravitated to also exploring and connecting with women and my gender identity. I discovered women's studies classes, very brand new at that time, and I first heard the term feminism and of this woman named Gloria Steinem. I was a history major and did papers on women in Spain, women in Mexico, women in Britain, and I went on to do my master's. And in my thesis, its title was Female Monasticism at the Time of the Dissolution. It was about Great Britain and when they took over the Catholic churches. And I had male fellow graduate students tell me one time, when we were all sitting around in our TA room, that women's history was pop history. And if I wanted to make a career as a scholar of history, I needed to get serious. I went to a favorite and trusted professor, and he backed them and suggested I concentrate on either religious women in the Middle Ages, given what I was doing my thesis on. That would be okay because that's part of church history, but I need to really know ecclesiastical history better. Or better yet, focus on Latin American studies like him. Again, I think through being told something like this: what you want to study isn't as good as others. You're saying you really fundamentally want to study about yourself, but that's just not worthy of study. The history of women in general and their contributions wasn't substantive enough. This is what I heard. And also, I was an Affirmative Action program beneficiary. I'd received a teaching assistantship, and then the state received monies for minorities. And my department substituted that money for the money they'd already chosen to give me. Very, very pragmatic. I appreciate that as an administrator now. It created more assistantships. It stretched the old dollars. But even I knew that that money should have been used to recruit some more minorities and not have me be the token. This was a history department that had had only one female faculty member until the mid-1990s. Today, it's more than half female, and there have been some female chairs as well. There were no people of color then, but today, there's a few more. When I finished my master's, I got married and was holding my 8-week-old daughter in my arms on graduation day. And so for job reasons, instead of at that time going on for the doctorate, we moved back to the Chicago area, and I began working for the Illinois Migrant Council as a job developer, and later as a program coordinator for educational access. And this was an amazing experience that allowed me to see the day-to-day experiences of agricultural workers, their reasons for being in the United States, doing that kind of work, the pride they had with working with their hands and working with the land, seeing a spiritual connection between them and the land, and then the indignities they had to suffer, as well as being targeted for their skin color. And it also took me a while to win them over. I'm fair-skinned, educated, never worked in the fields at all, and I'm coming to say, hey, let me work with you. And putting this in context again, my first job with them is job developer. And this was during the Reagan years. And the idea was that you would get them to settle out, that they wouldn't do, say they came from Mexico through Texas, through I want to say it's Oklahoma, Missouri, into Illinois, and up into Michigan, and over into Minnesota. And has anybody here ever seen the movie A Day Without a Mexican? Anybody at all? Thank you. Another good movie to go see. The premise of it is what would happen if all Mexican Americans, anybody we perceive like that, were gone. We all appreciate having affordable vegetables on our table, but the premise behind this program was that there was somehow something less good about working with the land and providing the food we were all eating. That we should help them find another job. That was my job as a job developer at, I think I was 24, 25 years old, working with men and women, with families, the children working too to put food on the table. And the lack of appreciation for the work that they were doing, that somehow working in a factory at minimum wage was somehow going to be better. There's an inherent condescension, an inherent sense of the cultural deficit model in that entire program. I couldn't have used those words at the time, but I did know that I thought it was very disrespectful to them. I then moved into helping migrant children through the school process and entering into college. And so at this time, and it's the late 80s, it's also the amnesty time. Ah, yes, the dreaded word they bandy about today. At that time, there was an attempt to take those that were here undocumented and give them legal status. There were a whole bunch of rules, and part of what they had to do was go to school. So I started teaching part-time in the evenings, teaching English as a second language and civics courses, because I had to take several exams, and the exams would be given in English in terms of being able to talk about United States history and those kinds of things. And so I taught that at the local community college to help our people's path to permanent residency and, in some cases, citizenships. Think how my own father's undocumented status, other family members' undocumented status, this amnesty program, the unending need for Latino workers in this country, and how that may have shaped my own current opinions on the immigration debate we're currently embroiled in. And then I returned to higher education full-time, working as the director of the Office of Hispanic Educational Development for the Illinois Institute of Technology. And there, my fuller immersion into understanding issues of access and inclusion developed. And I worked directly with talented students who today are emerging as leaders in their communities, in workplaces, and even in the political arena. I then moved into the role of Affirmative Action Officer for Southern Illinois University Carbondale and began a doctoral program. And my life changed again, and really quite profoundly. This is the first time I learned that there was something called white privilege, and privilege in general, and whiteness studies, and that there was something called critical race theory, and that qualitative research was as significant and valid and completely equal to quantitative research. That there was indeed a type of story called a testimonio, which does not translate exactly as testimony. Rather, it translates better as witness in the sense that some denominations of Christianity use it, to witness. Rigoberta Menchú, she witnessed. She did a testimonio, a collective story of what her people in Guatemala suffered. And I read that. In my doctoral studies, which was comprised mostly of non-trads, teachers and principals of K through 12, and then college administrators like myself, we're all working full-time trying to get our PhDs. And I go through the program. And in one class, it's called Culture of Education class, the professor does, don't call them film strips anymore, but it's like a little movie. She puts a video in. And it's about the situation of immigrant students in Los Angeles and the schools and the bad neighborhoods and gang and trying to get to school in the middle of gang stuff, and a number of different issues about what are children's lived experiences when they're coming to your classroom. What do you know about your students when you're going to go teach them? This was the point of watching it. And one woman raises her hand, and she's a teacher of second grade in a local school in a small farming community. And she says, I have something to say. And she's very brave. I have something to say. I know Carmen's not going to like it, and I know everybody's going to think I'm not politically correct, but what you're doing by showing us this movie is you're trying to play with our emotions. You are trying to make us feel bad for these kids, but we cannot feel bad for these children. These children are criminals. This is specifically what she said, and I only got my doctorate in 2007. I'm one of these 20-year PhDs, so this was actually quite recent. It wasn't that long ago that a teacher in a school with little kids of 7 years old called those she perceived as illegal, because that's why they're criminals. They are here illegally. They're using our resources. She went on. We had a big debate. I think our professor navigated that conversation really well so that she could feel safe in expressing her feelings, and I could feel safe in expressing mine, and that we could do it, and it is possible to have these debates of such opposing viewpoints and so much emotion in a civil way. She was teaching us as adults how to have these conversations. But I would say to you, and I've thought about this often, if I was a child with brown skin in her classroom, and they don't know if you're here legally or illegally, not that that should matter, and she thinks I'm criminal, you know that that child's going to feel it. How are they going to learn? And why should they be made to feel that way? And then, as part of that class, we also read a book by a Harvard College of Education researcher, Lisa Delpit, called Other People's Children's. And the premise of that book and her entire thesis and the scholarship behind it is that our children of color are unhappy in our schools across this nation. It was very profound for me. And I can share lots more stories, and I'll share one. I'm in an organizational theory class, you know, how administrative theory and how structures are and systems and external forces and internal forces. And our professor is talking about the workplace and how it has changed over time, that it's not like the old 50s factories with the supervisor overlooking this large warehouse of people busily doing stuff or putting widgets on, that today's workforce needs a whole different way to be motivated. We have to look at them as individuals, what we might call right now culturally competent, but that there is still a great need for those that can do routine tasks, and where might we find such workers? And what he was moving towards was a discussion on including people with disabilities, particularly more severe disabilities, in the workplace, and how we might do that respectfully and get work done and they're productive. And a principal of a grade school spoke up and she says, I know. And he calls on her and she says, Mexicans. We have lots of Mexicans in my community, and they are good little workers. They don't mind mundane tasks. They don't mind routine tasks. They are great at it. They'll do stuff over and over because they're such hard workers. Clearly, she thought of that as a compliment. But I ask you to go deeper. I caught it instantly and spoke up. How are they counseling these students about what career choices they have? How does that attitude affect? And again, I asked to think about condescension and this notion of cultural deficit, that one culture has deficits and we must lift them up. So these things shape you. These are the things I think about. And so again, we could share a lot more stories about how we all perceive difference and how we see other people as just that, as others. And we could together discuss the history of and our path to our first Black president, perceived as Black president of the United States, and the continuing struggle and remarkable reaffirmation during this presidency that the problem of the 20th century, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, is the color line, and now we would insert 21st century. We see that all over the place. Islamophobia. You see people who are different, and particularly if their skin color is different, I submit to you that's still dominant. And God help them if they're a different color and poor too. And you can see how it would be shaped to make a statement like that. I hope you see where a statement like that comes from. How being raised in a Catholic school makes me think about those less fortunate. Being called a spick when the best I have is a Chicago accent and I used to have a lot more freckles than I do now. But what it all means is that these kinds of things have shaped me and my education and my career path. I loved education and knew I wanted to stay in this arena. I've taught classes, I've worked for the Illinois Migrant Council Assistance Program, helping people get into college. And most of my career has been focused on getting students of color, and particularly Latinos, into the universities that I work for. But I noticed that really fundamental change happened when you could be at the higher levels in administration, when you could be a voice for what we now call diversity, or what we've evolved to call diversity. Reporting to the president, at the table with the vice presidents and other leaders, and committing myself to always speak up, to always witness, to always insert the diversity lens into all we do, vertically and horizontally, to try and directly affect policy and procedure, culture and climate, attitude if possible, and certainly behavior. So I go back to my wheel and what my spokes are, and what I realized as I explored is that some of my spokes are narrower and some of my spokes are wider. I have a stronger affinity to some dimensions of my diversity, and not that others are not as important, but they are not as affected. And so I would say that one spoke as mother, one spoke as professional, one spoke as Chicago Latina, one spoke as, and if anybody wants to ask me what this means, ask me afterwards, social justice, cafeteria Catholic, activist, straight, ally, scholar, partner, teacher, lifelong learner, feminist. But what is at the middle? What is this inner wheel or circle? I'm still exploring that, but I think right now I'm beginning to consider the possibility that what is at the center are the things that stir my soul. I'm still pondering if I want to call my center circle from which my spokes emanate a soul or not. It seems kind of dramatic. It's not sitting well on the tongue. It doesn't seem to fit totally. But I know that my center has to do with the emotions and convictions my life's path has brought out in me. Rage at injustice. They are strong words, they're dramatic words. We don't like anger or rage. We don't want people to say that. It's scary. But I feel the rage. And I equally dislike feeling impotent. So I feel compelled to take action. And I was once told in counseling that anger is considered a cloaking emotion. That many of us use anger, we lead with anger because we don't want to feel the deeper, more profound stuff. And so I've worked hard to let the sadness come through. The stuff that makes you cry and makes you not sleep at night. About the deep impact of injustice in all its forms, be it something like discrimination of some kind, war, violence, issues of poverty, environmental degradation, all the dimensions of human rights. It's the use of the word human rights that attracted me at first to this job. Equal to these, what we might term negative feelings in my spoke, in my little soul, are the feelings that are evoked when you work with others and get good results. Building your food bank reserves, or stopping a bad situation, or helping and especially watching a student succeed. That incredibly indescribable feeling I talked about before that comes with fighting for something that is right, whatever that right is that touches us within the dimensions of human rights. Also in this center is the connection between lived experience and being able to name it through the scholarship of others, and be able to articulate that all lived experiences are equally valid, that privilege of many kinds exists, and that that privilege needs acknowledgement and the willingness to extend that privilege universally, and that each of us can help do that. That's why I love higher education. We probe so many different aspects of the human condition or what's important to the human condition from any discipline. The whole point is to help advance humanity, if you will. I would submit that to you, however hokey or whatever that may sound. I believe it. And that it is through higher education that someone like me can stand here and explain to you what it means to grow up as a Chicago Latina and be called a spick and turn it into a job. So that pretty much concludes it. For some of my colleagues in the audience, I've been here long enough that some of them have witnessed and experienced the passion of my convictions and my Chicago style. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll open it up to questions. We have a question up in front, and I'll try to repeat them so the people in the back can hear. And then this is Ghazi. He's going to give me a hard time. No.
Carmen, you are a soft other, I'm a hardy other.
I'm a soft other and you're a hardy
You're
other?
not as visibly other as I am.
Correct, I am not as visible. That is my point. I
You
am
don't have
very
an accent,
fair-skinned. No accent.
no accent, so there's so much of it that I can relate to, including working with backpacks, picking fruit and yak in my early life. There's so many other experiences you relate in a different way I can share with you. You know, when you're talking about this, I don't know about others, I was feeling a little bit teary-eyed. I can feel it, I can sense it. My kids grew up here. On balance, life has been wonderful, but there are experiences here with my children, you know, camel jockey and this and that. You were a spec, I was a camel jockey.
Yeah, he's saying he was called a camel jockey on many occasions.
Yeah, my children and so forth, and go back, we come from. Question I want to ask you is a commentary. In your professional life, including here, are you still so often being identified in subtle ways, very subtle ways, as the other?
What he's asking is, in my professional life, and including here, am I still being identified as the other, and either overt or in subtle ways? And I would say that that is a little more difficult to answer because I have deliberately crafted and put forth and lead with that identity of the other, and insisting that although I cannot speak for all others, I am a voice of the other at the seats of power. So I make people see that way. So I would say, though, that well, we got a lot of women in here. This is across the board. I'm not talking about UI. There are a lot more challenges to being female in a room, no offense, but in a room full of men. You have an idea, nobody listens. The male repeats it later on in the meeting. Everybody thinks it's the greatest idea since sliced bread. And this happens on a routine basis often, that it's very hard to be heard. You have to work twice as hard. And when you work twice as hard, you might be the B word, you might be shrill, you might be aggressive, you know, those kinds of things, instead of that assertive, take charge person. So those are the challenges I would say I face more professionally, as being disregarded sometimes, and I think it's gender-based. I will say I'm disregarded sometimes because I don't like what I'm saying, and that's fair. Not everybody's going to agree with me or like what I'm saying at a given moment, and I can accept that. It's when you're almost ignored that's very, very hard. There's that casual kind of condescending being ignored. And I see some women in the room, and maybe males feel this way in some settings too, nodding their heads. So, thank you, guys. Yes, Kenton.
Carmen, how well is the University of Idaho doing in creating a welcoming and inclusive climate for students and faculty of color, those that are different from me, since I'm part of the dominant white male culture of this place? Are there some things we're doing well and some things where we ought to be doing better?
You know, when I moved here, I'm moving from Illinois, and I'm moving to northern Idaho. And I'm a out Latina who says affirmative action is great, and my parents, not my parents, I'm sorry, my family members and my daughter were very scared for me. Northern Idaho has a reputation, and that's just the way it is. And University of Idaho sits in the middle of northern Idaho, and we must deal with that on a daily basis. The state of Idaho has changed dramatically. The number of Latinos here have grown immensely. This is a university that is looking to increase its student population from many different dimensions to 16,000 students, and the dominant growth in K through 12 in Idaho in particular is Latino. And yet we have people jump on a stage right here, grab a microphone out of a group of permanent residents and citizens who happen to be of Mexican descent and start yelling how immigrants have destroyed this country in the middle of the Cesar Chavez celebration. And so we need to deal with that. We need to make sure we are not defined by what happens. We're defined by how we respond. And every one of us here is UI. UI is not they. The UI community is not me and Kenton and other folks. It's every one of us in this room. And together, we have to believe in the mission that it is our responsibility to help our diverse populations, including ourselves, including the much maligned white male, feel welcome, feel respected, feel partnered with for success. So although I just said my flowery words, I think we work at that very intentionally here, and that is our greatest success. When you can think about it and you can talk about it and you can be intentional about it and you can challenge each other to think these ways, you are being successful because you're at least putting it on the table. You're not ignoring it. I've been at places that sweep things under the rug, that don't discuss it. They want it to go away. And we're much more conscious and deliberate of it here. Brought Jesse Jackson last year, Reverend Jesse Jackson from Chicago. And 5,000 people in that Kibbe Dome, and only 4 sad little haters on the outside. That was remarkable. That's a success. I had somebody, a lifelong Idaho native from a small town, say, I would have sworn to you this was a bad idea. I would have sworn to you I would never see anything in my lifetime like this in northern Idaho, and that people would enjoy it, celebrate it, come to it, and in such huge numbers. That was a neat thing to hear. That's a success. That really is. But we can't let that go. So just a little plug while I got you here seated as my captive audience on Cesar Chavez Day this year. On Saturday, March 30th, I got that right, we have Dolores Huerta coming to this campus. Dolores Huerta was the female leader of the migrant farm worker, agricultural laborer movement, equal to Cesar, who is who we always talk about. Dolores fought side by side with him. And let's not forget, you know, oftentimes you got crisscrossing of identities and discrimination issues. So if you're of color and female and poor, you know, the issues become even deeper. She is still a vibrant, vibrant speaker, and she's in her early 80s. So we do not have too much longer, probably, to have her with us and to be able to speak to us. And I hope everybody in this room will come, because it's an opportunity to learn. And this is living history, if you will. And then on Friday, January 13th, we'll have 2 of the original Freedom Riders here. Does everybody here know who a Freedom Rider is? The Freedom Riders were the ones that got in those buses and drove to the South during the Civil Rights Movement and faced the dogs and faced the hoses. And we'll have an African-American husband and wife coming to campus to talk to us about those experiences. It's an anniversary year of it. And so I'd say this, not just to put in the plug and keep talking, there may be other questions, but to say these are the mindful, intentional things we try to do every day. There are things that people put up on these walls, and it allows people to write on them. And some of the stuff that's written is very hateful, and we don't take it down. We allow for this to happen. That's how great we are. That's why I like it here a lot. A Chicago Latina in northern Idaho at the University of Idaho.
Carmen, as a former bilingual teacher from California, Los Angeles, I dealt with a lot of frustration during the years as a teacher of urban Latino students. And so they had at least a triple whammy against them from the very beginning. There was the culture at large, there was the biases of many of my colleagues, and the attitude of their peers who come up if they showed any interest in achieving academically. How do these kids get to the university level where they can find themselves, can find their own centers?
That's a big question. She's been a teacher in Los Angeles, a bilingual education teacher, so working with lots of Latino students, lots of immigrant students, and seeing what they faced, especially in terms of discrimination and lack of resources and being held back on a daily basis. How do they get to the university? And that is a multifaceted answer, but I would say to you, like many of us, even one person can make a difference. There's some really, really great books out there, scholarly works, on this exact question. How is it that students from many backgrounds, including poor white rural students from very hard to reach areas in Idaho and in Southern Illinois and in Kentucky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do they do that? And it's typically somebody, a family member, a teacher, a minister that helped them see that there were other paths. And education has always been the path for social mobility in this country. Well, I think that, well, I won't get into it, but it was more affordable in past years, so it's probably a better avenue now, avenue then than now. But I think that that would be one answer, and that is the difference a person can make. We all notice difference. We all feel it. It's natural and normal. We've been raised in a way, we're walking down the street and a person goes by in a wheelchair and I'm a little kid and mom's dragging me along. And what happens when I'm staring at the person in the wheelchair? What does mom say? Don't stare. You're taught that somehow difference is weird, that you didn't notice it. Note the difference. Not to make my mother some kind of shrine and queen, but she told me people were like ice cream instead of don't stare at the black people, which is exactly how it happened. I was walking down the street. Oh, their skin, they're different, you know, and being a kid. And she told me this. We can make a difference. And we notice difference. It's probably one of the hardest things. We've been conditioned not to see difference. We feel it. We are hesitant. We might even be scared because it's so different from anything we've experienced. It's okay to notice difference. It's how we act on it. How willing are we to set aside biases and fears and conditioning to reach out to others? There is, you have heard my story. There is no such thing as one person better than another, one culture better than another, one set of beliefs better than another, in my book. Difference just is. It isn't better, best, worse. And those of you that had to sit through my little Diversity 101, you've heard this before. So, other questions? Thank you, everybody.